Support for Colorado Today comes from Safeway, where pharmacists can fill your pet's prescriptions, helping you pamper and protect your pet with pills, peanut butter, toys, and treats. Stop into the store today or visit Safeway.com.
Support for Colorado Today comes from Credit Union of Colorado. With access to over 30,000 ATMs and a mobile app, they're dedicated to offering the services of a big bank with a heart. Learn more at honestlygood.org.
Have you ever heard of a slopper? It is a burger smothered in chili, kind of like a gringo torta ahogada for those of you in the know. I just learned about them today. It's a specialty in Pueblo, which calls itself the home of the slopper. The reason I'm bringing them up is because it's currently Slopper Week, where you can have a chance to eat a slopper and earn $250. And I just wanted to see how many times I could say slopper in an intro. I'm Arlo Pérez Esquivel. Coming up, Medicaid is on the chopping block, and Coloradans might have a lot to lose.
I can work in the community, run my own business, and live a pretty normal life.
Then, a Venezuelan gang has been declared a national enemy. What does that mean for Coloradans who have nothing to do with it?
They accused many people who were just at the nightclub of being in the gang.
Plus, soon you might not be the only one making money off of your March Madness bracket. Colorado universities might start paying their student athletes. It's Tuesday, March 18th. Here's the news in Colorado today. The volatility in the economy is making it tough to predict exactly how much Colorado has to cut from its budget.
What we see is the tariff's on one day, it's off the next day, it's on the next day, it's a different one, it's doubling, it's cut in half. That uncertainty, people just start to get worried and pull back because they don't know what's going to happen.
Mark Ferrandino is the governor's budget director. He expects Coloradans to spend less, and he's upping the chance of a recession from 25 to 40%. He and other economists reported to state lawmakers yesterday. Here's the chief legislative economist, Greg Sabetsky.
You should be aware that there's a risk that you could be in a much better position than what we're showing you, and there's also a risk that you could be in a much worse position than what we're showing you.
What has stayed consistent is that state lawmakers have to cut about $1 billion from the budget over the next few weeks. They've already said they intend to cut about $1 million from grants that help food banks. They've also cut roughly $500,000 from diaper distribution centers. Going forward, Medicaid is getting the most attention. Medicaid expanded to include hundreds of thousands more Coloradans over the past decade plus. With that growth came a growing impact on the state budget. One of those newer Medicaid patients is Kurt Wolf. His story shows the important role that Medicaid expansion has played for some Coloradans and the hard choices that lawmakers have to make. CPR's John Daly visited Wolf at home. Hey there, John.
Hey, Arlo. Yeah, Kurt Wolf owned a handyman franchise, and then more than a decade ago, he contracted West Nile virus. So Wolf is paralyzed. He does have some movement in his hands. He spends much of his day in a wheelchair.
We didn't even realize this was a side effect that could happen. And the good news is I can feel everything. I can flex and move things, but the large muscle groups won't move.
And now in his 60s, he still is working.
What does he do?
He's an accomplished bowler, and he runs a company that makes parts for a wheelchair bowling system.
I live pretty independent considering my level of injury. I'm pretty dang healthy. I can advocate for people. I can work in the community, run my own business, and live a pretty normal life.
How does Medicaid help him do that?
Well, you heard him say he lives pretty independently. He does rely on a team of people who come to his house in Thornton to help him with basic things.
7 days a week, someone gets me out of bed, gets me dressed, range of motion, feeds me breakfast, all the way to shaving me.
Now, that care is paid for by something called the Medicaid Buy-in for Working Adults with Disabilities program. It was offered when Medicaid expanded in Colorado and many other states under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, more than a decade ago. It allows working people with disabilities who make under a certain amount of money to buy into Medicaid to get the care that they need. His significant other, Carol Johnson, told me that without the help, Wolf would be in a nursing home.
Curtis survived 12 wonderful years, unfortunately in the condition he's in, but has survived. He wouldn't have survived in a nursing home this long at all.
Right. So you're saying maybe he wouldn't be alive
He wouldn't
today?
be alive, right? I'm saying within a short time he would have not survived.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. Could he pay for it himself if his Medicaid coverage was discontinued?
He says he doesn't have the money for that if this program were discontinued, so this care would go away.
It's not just Colorado lawmakers who are considering cutting Medicaid funding. In Washington, federal lawmakers are also having this conversation. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. The state budget would be bad enough as it is this year, but many in the health system warn that the federal government entirely pulling the rug out from under programs that were built up after the Affordable Care Act was implemented could be catastrophic. For years, Colorado and other states have relied on the federal government for money for Medicaid. And you're right, both the state and federal funding are at risk. And it's a long shot that the state could make up for the loss of major federal Medicaid funding.
And how does Wolf see all this?
Well, he says he remembers Trump's campaign promises to cut wasteful spending, but he didn't think it would affect Medicaid. And of course, he wants policymakers to think carefully right now.
Where do you cut? Do you cut to the quick? Or you cut till it bleeds? That's too far. You got to make smart decisions. It's going to be a huge negative effect. So I don't want to throw a scare out there, but yeah, I'm concerned about it, not just for myself, just for the economy and everyone in general.
Now, the Republican Congress is weighing $880 billion in Medicaid cuts. That's in the budget resolution that the House passed. The specific program Wolf uses, this buy-in for working adults with disabilities, is one of the programs that's at risk. An expert with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation told me if Colorado were to drop coverage for the people who got insured via the Medicaid expansion, the estimate is about 230,000 people would become uninsured.
John, thank you.
You bet.
Is having tattoos or being at a party enough to link you to a gang? For law enforcement trying to link immigrants to the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, the answer is yes. This matters a lot right now since President Trump is using a law, usually reserved for wartime, to have the members of that gang deported without much due process. Meaning, if you have been incorrectly labeled as a member, there is not a lot of recourse to prove your innocence. CPR's Allison Sherry is reporting on how this is unfolding in Colorado. Allison, what is the evidence law enforcement has been using to argue someone is part of Tren de Aragua?
What we have seen in open records is that the evidence is thin. It's tattoos, specifically clock and rose tattoos. It's maybe a gesture in a jail. Our colleague Ben Marcus was listening to an immigration court hearing for a man last week who was at a nightclub when federal agents came in, and they accused many people who were just at the nightclub of being in the gang.
You mentioned tattoos. Something like a third of Coloradans have tattoos. But the thing that is tying the people being accused right now is that they're Venezuelan, right?
Right.
So nationality has to be part of it as well.
It is. I interviewed a law professor at CU. Her name's Violeta Chapin. And she described that as an outdated and wrong way of looking at things. It's very seldom that an entire nationality of people are going to be enemies of the United States, especially people who are actually fleeing a dangerous place to try to kind of make a life here. We know that there's a TDA presence in Aurora.
That's Tren de Aragua, correct?
That's Tren de Aragua, yes. But we know that there are a lot of people who aren't part of TDA who are living in apartment buildings that there may be some criminal activity happening. I think Chapin's concern is that this is guilt by association. And the result is, just because someone lives next door to someone who may be doing some criminal activity, that they're all gang members because they all came from Venezuela.
Over the weekend, hundreds of people were already deported. The Alien Enemies Act is currently being challenged in court. If it survives that challenge, what does it mean for the alleged members?
Well, the Alien Enemies Act gives the Trump administration the freedom to ignore court hearings and due process and just really largely, broadly sweep people out in the name of, the fact that they're enemies of the United States. They could do vast roundups. They could just deport people and we wouldn't know who they were. It wouldn't have mattered if they had an asylum claim. It wouldn't matter if they had work authorization. There'd be very little judicial oversight. They would just get on a plane similar to the El Salvador plane that we know left, and we wouldn't know who was on there, and they would just go. So we don't know if anyone from Colorado was on that plane this weekend. I've been checking into that from a number of different people. The administration has not said who these people were or what they were accused of doing. That's the issue here. We don't have a lot of checks and balances, and that's what the Alien Enemies Act does, is kind of gives the administration the final say, which I think worries a lot of people.
Allison, thank you very much. College athletes will be able to get paid directly from their universities as soon as April. This is required by a federal court settlement, and Colorado just passed rules to make it possible. Bossy talked about this with CPR's Ben Marcus.
Ben, many may already be seeing Shedeur Sanders on Gatorade ads, so what's the new part here?
Yeah, so for the last several years, student athletes have been able to sign third-party name, image, likeness contracts with Gatorade, Rolex, Nike. The big change here is that federal court settlements are forcing universities to pay the athletes. Universities get large contracts for TV rights deals, ticket sales, and they're going to have to share some of that now with their star players.
Universities get their money from donors and from taxpayers. How much might these athletes get paid?
None of the name, image, likeness rights will come from taxpayer dollars because the athletic departments are largely self-sustaining because they have TV rights deals and ticket sales. We don't know exactly how much athletes are going to be paid. It'll be different for the name, image, and likeness for each athlete. The quarterback of the football team is going to make more than the backup center, for instance. But because these contracts have never been negotiated before, we don't really know what they're going to get paid. We know the football program brings in millions at CU Boulder, and so it's likely that these contracts will be substantial with the star players.
Was it unanimous in the legislature to pass these rules?
It passed overwhelmingly, but there was bipartisan concern throughout the process about keeping the individual amounts that we pay athletes in Colorado secret. So they'll tell us how much the football team is paying in name, image, likeness rights in aggregate, but we won't know how much the quarterback is making versus the backup center. They just didn't have the votes to require that kind of transparency, so it has passed without that.
Why was this important for the schools?
So for a few reasons. They were concerned that students who were getting paid substantial amounts for their name, image, likeness would have a bad game and would maybe be harassed for that because of the amount they're being paid by the university to play football or basketball. They were also concerned about bad actors potentially preying on young men and women who are getting maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from the university. So there was deep concern about privacy for the athletes, but also that private universities aren't subject to open records law, so they wouldn't have to disclose what they're paying athletes. And in other states, they're keeping contract amounts private as well, even for public universities. So CU Boulder argued that it would be at a disadvantage if it had to disclose the individual payment amounts for name, image, and likeness.
So they want to stay competitive.
That was exactly their argument. They wanted to stay competitive with other schools, even in their own conference, that wouldn't have to disclose this information.
Will Governor Polis sign this?
We don't know yet. He could let it become law without his signature, or he could veto it. We do not know yet.
And, of course, this all comes just as March Madness gets underway.
I'm excited about March Madness, and just as a side note, we've talked a lot about football, but the basketball team is the second biggest revenue generator for CU Boulder, and so those CU Boulder basketball athletes will get paid substantial amounts as well.
Good luck on your brackets.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Additional reporting for today's show came from CPR's Benta Berglund and Stephanie Wolf. Ben Marcus also contributed reporting to the immigration story we talked about earlier. Colorado Today is made possible with the support from listeners like you. Have you hit follow for the show in your podcast app? I'm Arlo Perez Esquivel. This is CPR News.
Support for Colorado Today comes from Credit Union of Colorado. With access to over 30,000 ATMs and a mobile app, they're dedicated to offering the services of a big bank with a heart. Learn more at honestlygood.org.
Support for Colorado Today comes from Safeway, where pharmacists can fill your pet's prescriptions, helping you pamper and protect your pet with pills, peanut butter, toys, and treats. Stop into the store today or visit Safeway.com.